This is the end of history.
A true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies.
We believe that peace is at hand.
An axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world.
Democracy and freedom for all. We must choose in this crucial moment of human history.
So we've been looking at the origins and the shapings of the American colonies. We've already looked at Massachusetts and the other New England colonies, Virginia, New York, the Atlantic colonies like Delaware and Maryland, even Pennsylvania. And now, today in this episode, we're going to turn to the South before we jump into a couple of key historical events that converged within these colonies. Now, let's start with North Carolina. North Carolina's origins reflect the messy, improvisational nature of early Southern colonization. It was an evolving frontier shaped by scattered settlers, ambitious proprietors, Indian diplomacy, and shifting priorities of England's expanding empire. Unlike Virginia, which began with a single, dramatic landing at Jamestown, or Massachusetts, founded by organized religious communities, North Carolina emerged gradually from the forest and river valleys of the Albemarle region. Now, the state's origins trace way back to the mid-1600s when migrants from Virginia drifted southward in search of fertile land. We're going to find that trend throughout the early history of America, even after the Revolution. The settlers and people looking for more opportunity, they just keep drifting. Here it's to the south, later it's going to be to the west. But they're looking for fertile land, they're looking for fewer taxes, they're looking for greater autonomy. And these settlers, small farmers, former indentured servants, religious dissenters, frontier families, they established homesteads in this region. They were drawn by the region's rich soil, abundant game, relative isolation from the hierarchical plantation society that was already developing in the Virginia colony. So this early population created a culture that was quite rural, self-reliant, and resistant to outside control. In 1663, King Charles II, he granted this vast territory called Carolina, now that's North and South Carolina, all combined into one, Carolina, to 8 loyal supporters known as the Lord Proprietors. Awesome name, right? Well, the proprietary grant was both a reward for their help on restoring the monarchy in England and a strategic move to strengthen England's hold on the southeastern coast. The proprietors, they envisioned this orderly colony based on the fundamental constitutions of Carolina. This was a document drafted with this philosopher, the help of this philosopher by the name of John Locke. Now remember that name. He's going to come up again in a later episode. The reality on the ground in North Carolina couldn't have been further from the ideals envisioned by these proprietors or by John Locke himself. The Albemarle settlers had no interest in aristocratic schemes or distant authority. They valued local control. They valued minimal taxation, and they valued freedom from any outside interference. So all of the proprietors' attempts to impose taxes and political oversight really sparked immediate resistance there in Carolina. So in 1677, there was an outright revolution known as the Culpeper's Rebellion. Settlers overthrew the proprietary government, they arrested officials, and they ran the colony themselves for nearly 2 whole years. That rebellion reflected the colony's deep commitment to autonomy and foreshadowed its later revolutionary spirit. And one could argue the independent spirit that has persisted all the way to the Civil War, maybe even to today in this region of the country. Now, due to geographic limitations, North Carolina developed a society dominated by small farms rather than vast plantations. They had tobacco, corn, livestock, and naval stores. That's like tar pitch and turpentine, formed the backbone of its economy down there. So enslaved Africans were present from the late 1600s onward, but the colony's labor system was a lot more mixed, a lot less centralized than in the plantation the southern part of the colonies, in the plantation areas. So as English settlers expanded, tensions began to grow again over land, over trade abuses, and over kidnappings of native people into slavery there. These pressures culminated in the Tuscarora War of 1711 to 1715, and a brutal conflict that reshaped this region of the country. The defeat and the migration of the Tuscarora opened the interior to further English settlement and marked a turning point and the Carolinas expansion. By 1712, the vast Carolina territory, it finally and formally split into North Carolina and South Carolina, each with its own government. Now, South Carolina, further south, was envisioned from the start as this carefully engineered plantation society tied to global trade, to African labor systems and the geopolitical struggles of Europe and the Caribbean. We're going to keep that in mind, okay? This is going to be very important later on as we get into the Revolutionary period, because South Carolina and the Caribbean area, there's going to be a lot of similarities there. Beginning in the 1670s, planters from Barbados, already familiar with plantation agriculture and with enslaved African labor, they migrated to this area that would become South Carolina. And they brought with them this powerful economic model. And the powerful economic model was a harsh slave system and a vision of a plantation society geared towards the global markets. Their influence, these planters, these guys from Barbados, they would influence they would define South Carolina's identity for generations to come, all the way up to the Civil War. So the first permanent settlement, Charlestown, later called Charleston, was founded in 1670 on the Ashley River before moving to its present location in 1680. From the beginning, Charlestown became a vibrant port city, linking the colony to the Caribbean, Africa, and Europe. Okay, a port city linking to all these regions of the world. Its economy initially centered on trade with the Indian nations, and that included like the export of deer skins and, tragically, the enslaved Native Americans that they were capturing there. South Carolina became one of the largest exporters of Indian captives in North America during the late 17th century. Fitting with the origins of its founders, South Carolina also became virtually a slave colony, focused on the import and the export of slaves into and out of America, very similar to what these founders had already authored in Barbados. So the agricultural economy of South Carolina relied heavily, extensively on hard labor, and that helped further ramp up the slave trade and its link with the Caribbean. By the early 1700s, Africans outnumbered Europeans in South Carolina, creating further repression among the slave owners as they worked to manage the slaves with fear and brutal oppression. In their mind, they have to do this to keep the slaves from revolting, to keep the slaves who outnumbered them from taking over. So the recurrent boogeyman in South Carolina from the very beginning was this fear of slave revolts, and it's going to come up over and over again in this part of the history up to the Civil War. In 1719, frustrated settlers overthrew the proprietors and petitioned the crown for direct governance, and South Carolina became a royal colony in 1729. Now we keep going south. Continuing south, the last of the British colonies was Georgia. Last geographically in our journey south, but also in the timeline of British establishment. Established in 1732, more than a century after Virginia, Georgia was conceived not merely as an English settlement, but as the ideal was this bold social experiment, as well as a defensive bulwark on the southern edge of British America. So the driving force behind Georgia's founding was James Oglethorpe. He was this soldier, politician, and philanthropist deeply concerned with the plight of England's poor. So in the early 1700s, Oglethorpe, he saw that English cities were crowded with debtors, unemployed laborers, and people trapped in cycles of poverty. And so, serving on a parliamentary committee, he investigated the prison conditions, and he became convinced that many of these individuals deserved a chance at redemption rather than perpetual imprisonment. So he envisioned a colony where the worthy poor, that's his phrase, worthy poor, could rebuild their lives through hard work and land ownership. But Oglethorpe's humanitarian vision, it really aligned perfectly also with England's strategic needs. Those strategic needs would end up winning out in the end. The southeastern frontier of British America was dangerously exposed. To the south lay Spanish Florida, a persistent military threat and a haven for enslaved Africans fleeing English plantations there in South Carolina and the wider Carolina area. To the west, there were powerful indigenous nations like the Creek Confederacy. They controlled vast territories. So establishing a new colony between South Carolina and Florida, it would strengthen England's defensive line, protecting valuable rice plantations and expand imperial influence in that area. So Oglethorpe's ideal lined up perfectly with the British need to create a buffer state, basically, between the economic powerhouses of the southern colonies and the neighboring Indian and European powers further to the south in North America. In 1732, King George II, he granted Oglethorpe and a board of trustees a charter for the new colony named Georgia in the king's honor. And the trustees designed Georgia as a regulated, morally upright society. Landed ownership was limited to prevent the rise of large plantations. Slavery and rum were banned. Towns were planned with military precision. And settlers were expected to serve as citizen soldiers if war ever broke out. And this vision really reflected the Enlightenment era ideals of discipline, of equality, at least among the white settlers, and this civic virtues, right? That was the idea. And if you know the story, or if you could just look at some movies about the antebellum period of Georgia. It's like, where did this go? Whatever happened to this idea? Well, the first group of colonists arrived in 1733, and they founded Savannah, a carefully planned town laid out in a grid of squares that still defines that city today. And Oglethorpe forged these strong diplomatic ties with the Creek Indians, whose alliance was crucial to the colony's survival. And their relationship helped stabilize the frontier. It facilitated trade. But despite all these idealistic beginnings, we know things have to change, because at least we know how the story ends. Well, Georgia soon faced challenges despite Oglethorpe's idealism. The ban on slavery, intended to promote small farming and moral discipline, it proved deeply unpopular among settlers who envied the wealth of South Carolina's rice planters further to the north. The restrictions on land inheritance, that frustrated families seeking economic security. Military tensions with Spain culminated in the War of Jenkins' Ear, that was 1739 to 1748, during which Oglethorpe led an unsuccessful attack on St. Augustine, but successfully defended Georgia from invasion. By the early 1750s, the trustees' strict regulations, these idealistic visions that were imposing these strict regulations, had basically eroded. In 1752, Georgia became a royal colony. Slavery was legalized. Large plantations soon spread along the coast, transforming Georgia into a society more closely resembling its southern neighbors and epitomizing the southern aristocracy that was quite opposite of what Oglethorpe had actually envisioned. If you've ever seen the movie or read the book Gone with the Wind, its story romanticizes the Southern aristocracy before the Civil War and the so-called lost cause of the Old South. And all of it is pretty much set in Georgia as an icon of that era. Now, all of these colonies that we have covered in these last three episodes, they were being established. They were being organized along competing and often unique motives for a little over a century. And a couple of key events took place in the middle of the 18th century that really helped to define and shape the perspective of the British colonies, and had, the best phrase for it is just unintended consequences that would flow into the revolution that we're going to look at in the next few episodes after this. The first of these significant events in the middle of the 18th century is known as the Great Awakening. Now, the Great Awakening, it was one of the most transformative movements in colonial American history. That's what historians say. That's not what J.B. Shreve says. Historians say the Great Awakening was one of the most transformative movements in colonial American history. It was this sweeping religious revival that reshaped faith, reshaped culture, and ultimately the political imagination of the 13 British colonies. Emerging in the 1730s, cresting in the 1740s, The Great Awakening stirred hearts. It challenged established institutions and helped forge a shared identity among people who had long lived in these separate, loosely connected provinces. That would be a big deal when it came time for independence and revolution. And we can't really separate the two. There would not likely have been American independence or American revolution, especially in the form it took, if there hadn't been the Great Awakening. Now, at the center of the movement, this Great Awakening, stood Jonathan Edwards, this Massachusetts minister we briefly touched on in an earlier episode. This Massachusetts minister whose intellectual and spiritual intensity made him one of America's most important theologians, especially during this time period. Born in 1703, Jonathan Edwards combined his Puritan heritage with Enlightenment reasoning. The Enlightenment age was here, right? His sermons, most famously, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, they they weren't mere emotional appeals, but deeply argued calls for people to have a personal conversion experience with God. And the effects of that sermon itself are, well, they're kind of legendary. I remember hearing about these when we studied the history of revival when I was in Bible school. It's legendary. He would speak calmly, Edwards would, as he's speaking from the pulpit. But the vivid imagery of divine judgment gripped the congregation as he talked, gripped them with fear and with conviction and a sudden awareness of their spiritual peril. Eyewitnesses described people crying out, people weeping and clinging to pews as if they were physically suspended over their own imminent destruction, like they were going to go to hell. And the sermon ignited a wave of repentance that spread beyond Edwards' own church, and it fueled the broader Greater Awakening. Its dramatic impact revealed the power of revival preaching to pierce complacency and stir entire communities towards spiritual renewal. And Edwards insisted that the true faith required an inward transformation, not just outward religious observance. Across the Atlantic, right over in Europe, George Whitefield, an Anglican evangelist from England, he became the Great Awakening's most electrifying figure. He was born in 1714, trained at Oxford, and Whitefield was a gifted orator himself. He had this booming voice and dramatic style that drew crowds of thousands of people. He traveled up and down. He came over to North America, traveled up and down the colonies on multiple preaching tours, speaking in fields and towns and in town squares and meeting houses. And his message emphasized the necessity of the new birth. This was kind of a new idea at the time, a personal encounter with God's grace. And he delivered it with a charisma that transcended denominational boundaries. Now, when I say new birth is a new idea, when Christians today, when we read the New Testament, we see being born again, right? We take it for granted. But that really hadn't been, that idea, at least the way we see it today, was becoming new at the time of the Great Awakening. And this is really important right here, and one that many Christian believers don't even realize today. In the story of Christian and church history, the idea of a conversion experience is really not what we usually imagine it to be today, or at least it wasn't until the Great Awakening there in the 18th century. For most of Christian or church history, the idea of a spiritual conversion, the concept of spiritual conversion, usually involved a slow and a progressive journey of spiritual awakening that usually culminated in a moment of decision and proclamation, demonstrated through the process, the act of baptism. When you look at the New Testament, that's what you normally see. Even Paul's revelation on the road to Damascus, we think of that as a sudden event, right? But it was followed by a quiet period of at least 3 years in the desert as he sorted this revelation out and came to terms with it. Well, that changed during the Great Awakening. The idea of being born again came to mean something new at this point in history. A believer could identify the exact time, the exact moment when they surrendered their life to God and to Christ. And the Great Awakening spread through a combination of itinerant preaching, printed sermons, letters, word of mouth. Whitefield's tours were especially catalytic. He traveled from Georgia to New England, often preaching multiple times a day. Colonists who had never before seen a large public gathering suddenly found themselves part of crowds numbering in the thousands. They'd never seen anything like this, right? His ability to move people, sometimes to tears, sometimes to ecstatic joy, it created a shared emotional experience across regions of the continent, of the colonies. Even Benjamin Franklin, who was not at all a religious man, he attended one of Whitefield's meetings, and he was surprised by how moved he himself was. He ended up becoming one of the leading printers that helped spread the message of the Great Awakening, although he didn't really latch onto the faith or the creed so much. Local revivals, they erupted as ministers adopted the revivalist methods, right? Jonathan Edwards' Northampton revival of 1734 to 35, it became kind of a model, and reports of conversions circulated widely. The movement crossed denominational lines. Congregationalists, Presbyterians, Baptists, even some Anglicans participated in the Great Awakening. Print culture amplified the revival as newspapers and pamphlets, like what Benjamin Franklin was producing, spread accounts of spiritual awakenings from colony to colony. Perhaps the most lasting impact of this Great Awakening was its role in shaping a new sense of unity among the colonies. Before the revival, the 13 colonies were culturally, they were religiously very distinct with limited interaction. The awakening, it created the first truly intercolonial movement. People from Georgia to Massachusetts were hearing the same preachers, reading the same accounts, and experiencing similar spiritual transformations. And so the revival also encouraged habits of questioning authorities. All right. When revivalists challenged established churches, colonists learned to evaluate leaders for themselves. This spirit of discernment, combined with the experience of participating in a shared grassroots movement, helped prepare the colonies for later political cooperation. And this divide within the religious establishment itself, it began to take shape. And between what became known as the old lights and the new lights. That's almost like political parties within the religious establishment of North America, of the colonies at this time. Old lights often disapproved of the emotional and what they viewed as disorderly affairs of the Great Awakening's revival meetings. New lights saw themselves as just as much a champion and recipient of God's grace as anyone. And this division inspired a movement of lay ministers and leaders, people with no formal education, no formal training in theology, to take up leading and influential roles in the American churches. Nothing had been seen like this since the book of Acts. Keep this in mind. Being active in the grace of God was no longer about simply being educated. It was about reading the Bible for yourself, experiencing the grace and power of God for yourself, and spreading the good news to others. In his book, The Glorious Cause, the historian Robert Middlecoff, talking about the Great Awakening, he writes, these are the historian's words, "The awakening had naturally frightened some solid citizens just as it had inspired others. It was a frightening and even shattering event, with thousands of men, women, and children convinced that the Spirit possessed them, with revivalists denouncing the established ministry as unconverted, with churches splitting, and with excess in personal behavior everywhere in evidence." So although this was incredibly spiritual in its origins, the Great Awakening was, and obviously had its fair share of abuses without a doubt, but these unique happenings offered a specifically American contribution to the history of the faith, the history of the Christian church. It also set the stage for the next generation who would be willing to question, to challenge authority on the basis of their own ideals, their own reasoning, their own understanding. That same historian that I just quoted, Middlecoff, he went on to write that the people who identified as new lights, this new generation during the Great Awakening, they were basically forced to begin thinking politically, right? They were forced to start thinking this way, forced to start thinking in a new political manner, because the old lights, the old institutionalists, those who were seen as more solid citizens and leaders of the institutions, they began trying to outlaw different aspects of the revivals. And so people had to determine for themselves what was true and what was false based on their personal understanding of God and the Bible. Now, the second key event that I want to look at before this episode's done, and before we're done with this area with the colonies, this area of the history with the colonies, we need to look at this during the same period of what's going on, the same period of history in the colonies, and it's the French and Indian War. This is what it's known as in the American colonies. In Europe, it was known as the 7 Years' War. In fact, for the rest of the world, it's known as the 7 Years' War. But the French and Indian War, as it's known in the colonies, was really only the American theater of a wider conflict taking place between the British and the French for global domination. The origins of the French and Indian War and the struggle for supremacy between these two European empires on the North American continent, it lay in a fierce contest for control of the interior of North America. Remember, we talked about New France, and then we've got the British colonies. New France was set up along the rivers, right? And so this war was especially about divisions and contests in the rich and strategically vital Ohio River Valley. By the early 1700s, both France and Britain ended up claiming this vast region, but their visions for it began to collide by this point. France sought to link its Canadian and Louisiana territories through a chain of forts and alliances with various Indian nations, creating a continental empire anchored by trade. Britain, meanwhile, faced growing colonial populations eager for westward expansion, land speculation, and access to the fur trade. And so the surge for westward expansion would be a driving force in American politics and culture, not just here at the French and Indian War, but for the next 200 years. And it would play a large role in defining the American identity, as we're going to come to see. This was the beginning of all of that, right here with the French and Indian War. Tensions escalated as both powers built competing forts and courted Indian allies. In 1754, a skirmish involving this young 22-year-old man by the name of George Washington against French forces near Fort Duquesne in modern-day Pennsylvania ignited open conflict. Now, some historians see the French and Indian Wars as the opening of the American Revolution. And if you take that view, it could be said that right here, George Washington, because of his role played at this skirmish near Fort Duquesne, was a partner to the first shots fired in the Revolution. In any event, what began as a frontier dispute quickly widened into the global struggle. The war's origins ultimately rested on overlapping imperial ambitions, contested borders, and the fragile balance of diplomacy with the Indian nations that both empires sought to control and to manipulate, really. Soon the war pulled colonists out of their isolated provincial worlds and thrust them into a shared story of danger, a shared story of sacrifice, a shared story of identity, really. At the war's outset, the colonies were notoriously fragmented. Each guarded its own legislature. Each had its own militia, its own interest. At the same time, the bulging populations of the colonies were constantly looking to press westward into this frontier region. But the French threat in the west, amplified by alliances with powerful Indian nations, forced cooperation among these colonists now, in these colonies, that they had rarely existed before. Benjamin Franklin, he drafted what was called the Albany Plan of Union to bring the colonies all together. He printed a picture of a snake chopped into 13 parts with the inscription, "Join or Die." You may have seen this. I'm going to put a picture of it up on the blog, theendofhistory.net. In other words, with this picture, what he's saying, if they didn't start working together, if the colonies didn't start working together, they would become extinct. And Franklin's plan was an idea whose time hadn't quite yet come, but it captured the moment's urgency. The colonies needed to act together or they risked being picked apart. So while the plan failed politically, the idea of collective security took root and it would spread. So it was ready for application a couple of decades later when the American Revolution finally arrives. As British strategy intensified, thousands of colonial soldiers served alongside regular British troops. This mingling was quite transformative. Young men from Massachusetts marched beside Virginians. Pennsylvanians fought with the Carolinians. They shared hardships and victories, sobering realizations that they were part of something larger than their individual colonies, their individual province. Roads were cut through the wilderness. Supply networks stretched across regions, and newspapers carried war news from distant colonies, knitting together a sense of continental awareness. George Washington was a big hero in different aspects of this. He was looked up to by a lot of the colonists. And so people in Massachusetts are looking up to and admiring this guy from Virginia as they're reading about the stories in these newspapers during the war. The war also reshaped colonial attitudes towards Britain, or at least it began to. Early defeats like General Braddock's disastrous 1755 expedition, it revealed the limits of British military power, and it elevated colonial officers who understood frontier warfare. General Edward Braddock's expedition into the Ohio Valley became one of the most infamous failures of the French and Indian War. He marched with nearly 2,000 British regulars and colonial militia, and Braddock insisted on this European-style discipline and tight formations, ignoring warnings about frontier warfare. As his column approached Fort Duquesne, French and Indian forces ambushed him in a dense force, and the British line collapsed in chaos, and Braddock, mortally wounded, refused to retreat until the very end. Now, that defeat shocked the colonies. It exposed, for the first time in their eyes, British vulnerability. And it elevated leaders like this young George Washington guy who helped organize the retreat for Braddock's forces. And it became a defining lesson in North American warfare. Later victories, especially in 1759, the capture of Quebec, they were celebrated as joint triumphs. But beneath the surface, tensions were simmering. British commanders often dismissed colonial troops as undisciplined, while colonists bristled at condescension and the heavy financial burden placed on them to support Britain's war effort against the French. George Washington was in his early 20s when the war started. Both during and after the war, he had hoped to establish a military career in the British Army. Well, he wasn't only denied that honor or that privilege, he was effectively just dismissed out of hand. The British clearly saw a distinction between the native-born and the colonist. And it was a distinction that the colonists didn't recognize. And they were often surprised. They were often embittered when they were confronted by it when they saw it in the British. When the conflict ended, 1763, Britain emerged with vast new territories but staggering debt. And to manage its expanded empire and recoup expenses, Parliament imposed new taxes, tightened control over colonial trade and settlement. And this is where measures like the Stamp Act, the Sugar Act, the Proclamation Line of 1763 that felt to many colonists like betrayals, especially after they had bled and paid, in their mind, for Britain's victory in the French and Indian War. So this was the setting of the British colonies on the eve of independence, on the eve of revolution. In a very real sense, these subjects of the British king, the British Empire, they were slowly waking up to the reality of their true role in the British Empire. They weren't a nation yet, not by a good sight, but these unique developments in each of the colonies that had taken shape over several generations, along with the subtly uniting factors of the Great Awakening and the French and Indian War, they began to stir something. And that stirring, is what we'll turn to in the next episode as we look at the dawning of the American Empire and the era of independence and the beginning of revolution. I'm J.B. Shreve, and we're looking at the Empire, a 250-year American story. Be sure to share this series with your friends and family. We're about to get into the really good stuff for those of you who enjoy history as much as I do. The next episode is coming just days away.
Thanks for listening to The End of History with J.B. Shreve. Check out more episodes at iTunes and wherever you download quality podcasts. Join us online at theendofhistory.net for articles and essays from the end of history. Follow JB on Twitter at JB_Shreve. The End of History is produced by Windmill Media.